Okay, any questions on the exam?
Sure, Ken. What are you looking for in terms of format?
Okay, so I'm suggesting, or I'm expecting that you'll write me nice essays. So I'm looking for sentence and paragraph format, some kind of sort of logical sequence in there. I'm giving you 2 hours and you're writing 2 questions. So more or less what I want you to do is convince me that you've learned some stuff by writing on one of these themes for an hour. Okay? That's really going to be the main theme. The main focus is demonstrate what you've learned. Okay, any other questions? Okay, let's get into this then. So what I want to do in this lecture is bring some themes together. So we started out talking about living tradition, and I defined tradition as an embodiment of values. And I suggested that what we would do throughout the course was look particularly at the first generation of Alliance people, look at what they said, look at what they did, and see if out of that we can discern some values of our living tradition, some historic values that have kind of rooted the Christian and Missionary Alliance over the last 125 plus years. So what I want to suggest tonight are these are the things that I think are at the core of what it means to be Alliance. So the first is this idea of an alliance. And so I'm picking up just some very short phrases from those constitutional documents from 1887 that we've looked at together. So an alliance in that 1887 Constitution of the Christian Alliance was a fraternal union of believers. So the idea was we're not going to start an ecclesial organization. We're not going to start a church. We want an organization that can bring believers together from a wide spectrum of the Christian community. And I think a second theme was the Alliance broke out of the existing denominational focus of the Presbyterian Church in Simpson's time, because Simpson found that to be too constricting. He felt called by God to do stuff that was kind of outside of the boundaries of what was acceptable among sort of respectable evangelical groups at the time. And so I've captured a phrase from the Evangelical Missionary Alliance Constitution. The idea is to take the gospel to the destitute and unoccupied fields. And I'm using that rather loosely to indicate the message needs to get to the people who are neglected, the people who need to hear the gospel the most. Okay? And then the third theme, and this I'm pulling from the Fourfold Gospel, is this idea of Christocentric, that everything really comes out of our encounter with Jesus. So we're being called to this profound and transformative encounter with Jesus, and then we're being called from that out into a mission to the world to bring the gospel. Okay, so the three all intersect. Okay, so encounter with Jesus calls us to mission. The mission is to take the gospel to those places where the gospel is needed, where it's not being heard. And the way to do that is to find ways to bring people together, to build partnerships and alliances rather than to build walls. Okay? So what I want to suggest is that although there's these central values that I think characterize the Christian and Missionary Alliance, particularly in those early years, they're not without their tensions. So here we're going to talk a little bit about how with each of the values comes a creative tension that pulls us in different directions. So the idea of being an alliance, I want to suggest that there's a creative tension here between openness on the one hand and conformity on the other. All right? So to be an alliance, you need to bring people together. You need to bring people who are different and, you know, have different positions on things together. So you need a certain amount of openness to build this kind of coalition, to build this kind of an alliance. On the other hand, if you are defined only by the value of inclusion, in a sense, you lose any definition, you lose any identity. In a sense, you lose the ability to come around a particular sort of set of activities and move them forward. So in a sense, you need to balance that openness with a conformity, and out of that conformity comes an identity and a focus and an ability to get things done. Okay, so I'm going to kind of explain them abstractly, and then I'm going to try and illustrate them more concretely from some of the stuff that we've talked about. So just kind of, if that's a little confusing, hopefully by the time I'm done illustrating it, it'll be a little bit clearer. Okay, so this idea of innovation, I'm suggesting that the creative tension here is between pragmatism on the one side and structure on the other. So pragmatism is this idea that we're just going to go out there and do it. And I think we see that in a lot of the early alliance activities. There weren't a lot of strategic plans. There wasn't a lot of careful sort of strategizing. Mostly it's somebody came up with a good idea and then they just went ahead and did it. And sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. And so the other side of that, if we're actually going to resource people, if we're going to ensure that there's continuity and that there's sustainability, we need to build in structure, okay? On the other hand, if we push too far to structure, then we squelch innovation. Okay, so for innovation to happen, there needs to be this proper balance between pragmatism on the one side, that entrepreneurial spirit, but structure on the other side, which sustains and kind of keeps it moving forward. And then for the Christocentric, I'm suggesting that there's a tension between spiritual experience on the one hand, this idea of that intimate and close encounter with Jesus, and then doctrinal correctness on the other side. And again, we talked about this early on in the course, that we need scripture, we need doctrine to help us understand our experience. We need experience to bring life to our doctrine. So these two things need to be in balance. Okay, so what I want to do now is try and illustrate each of these values along with its attendant tensions, and then I will pause and ask for comment or questions to see if you're getting what I'm trying to suggest. So the first one of these, the idea of an alliance, wanting to bring people together to do kingdom work. This was the reason for not wanting to be a denomination and not wanting to have a statement of faith, because in a sense, this was seen as putting up barriers. All right, so right from the very beginning, the alliance was not to be an ecclesiastical body. All right, so that was to get openness. And then the idea of the 3.5-fold gospel. Do you remember what that was, the 3.5-fold gospel? I don't know whether this idea comes out when I do this course online. This is one of the things I do when I have people in class. So when we were looking at the membership requirements of the Christian Alliance way back in 1887, the idea was that you had to believe in Christ our Savior, Christ our Sanctifier, Christ our Healer. But if you didn't yet believe in the doctrine, the premillennial doctrine of Christ's coming, then you could be allowed into membership as long as you were willing to give premillennialism your prayerful consideration. Okay, so that's the idea of the 3.5-fold gospel. And the reason for that was the majority of evangelicals in the 1880s, 1890s, and into the early part of the 20th century were postmillennialists rather than premillennialists. And so if Simpson wanted an alliance and wanted to bring evangelical Christians together to get stuff done for the kingdom, and he would only take premillennialists, that would greatly reduce the people who could fit into his alliance. Okay? So that's the idea there. Now, we've looked at this Conference for Prayer and Counsel in 1906 to focus on what the distinctive teaching of the Christian and Missionary Alliance was. And at this point, the Alliance had been around for 19 years or so. And there were an increasing number of questions as to what the Alliance distinctive teaching was on various things, particularly on sanctification, but also on eschatology and some of the other sort of controversial bits. And so this conference was to bring some identity, to bring some clarity as to what the Alliance was built around. Okay? And so we're moving from this fairly radical openness on the one side to now beginning to define what that was all about, and particularly in terms of the teaching of sanctification. And then the Pentecostal revivals and that sort of major trauma that hit the Alliance just after this conference also led to questions as to what are we and what aren't we, and if you speak in tongues, are you in or are you out, and what does that do to the nature of the Alliance? And for the most part, the people who did speak in tongues left to join Pentecostal groups. Not all, but as we saw when we were looking at this, about a third of the membership of the Alliance left. Okay, so more conformity began to build around that as it went through that. And then in the early 20th century, again, we have the debates between fundamentalists and modernists. And again, this brought another level of conformity and that inward-looking focus and being far more careful in terms of who we associate with. It was around this time that a lot of the work that had been focused on social action and compassion was wound down because that seemed like too much like what the modernists were doing. And then on the other side, anything that was too experiential looked too Pentecostal, and so there was a concern about that. Okay, so kind of a narrowing of this idea of openness and an alliance in the early 20th century. Now I'm going to jump right up to the present time. And my suggestion is that many of our Alliance churches are actually characterized by this historic value of an alliance, which is to say that there are people from a wide variety of backgrounds and Christian traditions that feel comfortable, that feel welcome, that feel some sort of a connection with our churches. All right, so I'm going to pause here, stop talking for a moment or two, and let some of you talk. I want to test my assertion here at the end that this idea that the adherents to many of our Alliance churches are sort of demonstrate this idea of openness and ability to welcome in a broad variety of evangelicals. And I also want you to see whether this makes sense as one of the key values, and if you have any questions on sort of my quick review here. Okay, so I'll open it up for questions.
Just a comment on that. I would say in my experience, I would agree with that, and likely seeing it even more so in a case where the pastoral staff is not necessarily from an Alliance background or trained at CBC or Ambrose, which is the case at the church that we're at. And I think you'd see that openness played out to a greater degree in that case.
Yeah, I'm actually not sure that that's true, given the fact that we're at a church whose staff is primarily CBC Ambrose types, and we have a huge variety and people that you wouldn't expect. We have quite a large number of Catholics who still identify as Catholics, but also are adherents to our church, which a generation ago just wouldn't have happened. But you know, I think this idea of alliance is relevant still. Okay, other comments?
I think I've seen maybe the other side of the coin, where, well, I guess ironically, in this scenario, I think certain denominations felt embraced and welcome and comfortable, which eventually led to conflict with some on the other end of the spectrum, let's say, theological spectrum or doctrinal spectrum, leading to some issues and some problems. And some of those new, I guess, those emerging doctrinal sentiments, the individuals who were demonstrating them were shuffled out, basically, or pressured out in a way, and that was unfortunate in a way. I guess two of them are now leading to in that city. Don't mention the city. Are leading to the only growing churches in that city. So,
yeah, and this, of course, is it. I think that demonstrates the importance of this openness conformity balance. And I think one of the issues that we tend to have with people coming into the Alliance is they expect that we have very firm sort of perspectives on issues that we just don't have really firm perspectives on. And for some people, that's unsettling. And so if you have very strong people with very strong opinions who try to impose that on the church, that can take that particular congregation way over into the conformity space, and then it really stops being welcoming and it stops being that alliance. Okay, so I think there's dangers on both sides. There's dangers of moving too far to the openness, so you lose your focus. But there's also dangers in saying, well, this is how we want to define ourselves, and we want this. You know, if you're part of this church, you need to kind of come on board with these things. That then can significantly narrow the focus. Okay, good. Other comments? Or narrow the potential for being an alliance, I guess is where I was going with that. Okay, this program doesn't have a hands up function, so if you want to talk, you just have to unmute and start talking, and then I'll know you want to talk. All right, next slide, here we go. So this idea of being innovative. So on the pragmatism side, I have that idea of taking the gospel to all nations, and sort of the really innovative and sort of out-of-the-box stuff that the early Alliance was doing was sending men and women, sending lay people as well as clergy, and really trying to break down as many barriers as possible in defining who could be involved in kingdom work. And I think one way this played itself out in the ministry of the Gospel Tabernacle was that almost everybody who kind of came to Jesus in some kind of a evangelistic effort was almost immediately put to work and became a volunteer in some kind of ministry capacity. And it's, in a sense, discipleship was done in that in ministry. All right. Now, you may remember the story of the Congo mission. This was before even the alliance was formed, but the Gospel Tabernacle congregation started its own mission to evangelize the world. And so they had the first group of international workers trained at the Missionary Training Institute. They got 1 year's training, and then they were sent out to missionize Africa. And the story is the leader of the group died, and then the group kind of lost its focus, and 3 of the members of the 5 that were sent out sort of disappeared back to North America, and one of them stayed but joined another mission. All right, so that was an example of being really high on pragmatism, but having virtually no structure to ensure the success of that innovative adventure. Okay, so it failed, I would say, because of a lack of support, a lack of structure to kind of sustain and move it ahead. And this story became quite common in the early years of the Evangelical Missionary Alliance. Very high attrition rates. There's a little book written by George Partington called 25 Wonderful Years, which charts the first 25 years of the Christian Missionary Alliance. And almost the back half of it are obituaries of missionaries who were sent out and who passed away in a whole variety of ways. And so the idea there was this pragmatism was very high, but there was a very high human cost for that as well. And so what the mission began to do was increase the amount of training that they gave to missionaries, increase the supports, build structures, develop sort of field structures, and all of that. So we begin to see this professionalization of the missions force on the structure side, where rather than we're just going to send everybody who really loves Jesus, we want to be sure that the people are trained and have the resources that they need to be effective. And so this led throughout the 20th century, we're kind of going through the 20th century here, to a growing missions bureaucracy. More and more people, and particularly more and more people in North America, making decisions about what should happen on the field, and a highly centralized organization. And so one of the consequences of this, and we talked about this a little bit when we were talking about missions, and the video lecture by Ruth Ann Gilbertson talked about the Canadian Alliance taking over its own missions program and having that reset moment where it began to question a lot of the structures that were established for good reason, established to make the mission sustainable and effective. But at the same time, we're beginning to get in the way of innovation and get in the way of taking the message to where it really needed to be. So there came to be a revisioning of all of that structure. And those of you who are in the IW system now are experiencing a very different experience than what I started out in way back in the 1980s, where it was very much a kind of a cookie cutter kind of an approach. Oh, so before we go on, let me pause and ask: are there questions or comments, or this idea of innovation? Does that make sense? Do you understand how there's this tension between pragmatism and structure?
Yeah, I can remember being in a missionary kid, and I think there's some other MKs here, but I remember being in Africa, and I remember the letter writing that would go on back to headquarters, and sometimes sometimes good, sometimes not so good. But yeah, there was definitely this perception of that you weren't out there on your own. There was top cover.
Yeah, and sometimes that was helpful, and sometimes that got in the way of ministry, right? Yeah. Good, thanks. Other comments? Okay, here we go. So this idea of being Christocentric. We looked early on at the parallels between the Fourfold Gospel and Simpson's biography. So in a sense, some of the key themes of alliance thinking and teaching grew out of an experiential encounter. And this, in a sense, was part of what the holiness movement in the late 19th century was all about. And this developed into the connection with the Pentecostal movement. So there's this close proximity in terms of experiencing Jesus, experiencing the power of the Holy Spirit, the transformation of the Spirit between Alliance folks and Pentecostals. As we move into the 20th century, and again the encounter with modernism and fundamentalism, doctrinal correctness became a much more important push. So in 1928, we have the first attempt at a formal doctrinal statement for the Christian and Missionary Alliance. But as we saw, it was only applicable to Bible schools. Okay? And so the idea there was that if we can keep our training institutions free of heresy, then the movement itself will be okay. And so there was no attempt to impose a doctrinal statement on the Christian Missionary Alliance as a whole, but the idea was to ensure the doctrinal correctness of the faculty of the training institutions. And then what I call the Alliance scholastic tradition. And this is really the work of early generation of Alliance scholars who began to write about the Christian and Missionary Alliance in terms of Alliance distinctives. So here the focus was how the Alliance is different from everybody else, right? What is the distinctive theological sort of focus or insight of the Christian and Missionary Alliance? And in fact, the course that is now called Alliance History and Thought used to be called Alliance Distinctives. And I think that picks up on this idea. And so the idea was if we can figure out, if we can codify our Alliance teaching, and if we can be sure everybody says the right things in the right way, then we can be sure that we remain Christocentric. Okay? But the approach that I take, you've probably got this by now, is that that's not really the way to preserve the heart or the values of the Christian Missionary Alliance, or even this idea of a Christocentric experience. And certainly this idea of the Alliance being different and the Alliance needing to protect a particular doctrinal stance as key to our ongoing health and well-being was very much there in the editorial policies of Christian publications, which unfortunately no longer exists. It's fallen fallen prey to all the changes in publishing and so on with electronic media and so on. All right, now we go back to the other side, this refocus on spiritual experience. While the focus on doctrinal statement for the Bible colleges, and while this attempt to really solidify what Alliance Doctrine was all about was happening on the one side, on the other side we have A.W. Tozer, who was a little bit of a mystic and who felt that fundamentalism, with its very strict focus on literal interpretations of the Bible and Bible knowledge, was really missing some of the key aspects of spiritual encounter. And so what we have in the writings of Tozer is calling people to a knowledge of the holy, but a knowledge of the holy which isn't an intellectual knowledge, but which is really transformative and a spiritual encounter rather than just a cognitive one. All right. And the reading that I had you look at by David Schroeder on the centrality of Christ in the fourfold gospel makes this point very well, that really it's not about getting our doctrine of sanctification really nailed down. It's really about leading people to an experience of the holiness of Jesus, okay? And I think that's much more in line with Simpson's teaching than this focus on systematizing Simpson's thought so that we have a distinctive Christian and Missionary Alliance theology. And I would also suggest that what we see with David Hearn and his leadership of the Christian Missionary Alliance over the last number of years is calling us to experiencing Jesus anew. And the link that I have here is to something that I think was put out in 2013, 2014, fairly early on, that where Dave is sort of laying out his vision for what the Alliance, what he would like the Alliance to be under his leadership. Okay, again, I'm going to shut up for a bit here and invite comment. Anything strike you? Any questions, any comments?
Yeah, I would say that probably one of the things that drew my husband and I to the Alliance Church was more of the spiritual experience and less of the doctrinal correctness.
Yeah, good. Anybody else?
Actually, I had a question, if it's okay.
Sure, please.
How has the Alliance, like we know how the Alliance kind of had some issues with Pentecostalism and Pentecostal revival and losing a third over the issue of tongues and such. How does the Alliance today interact with some of these other movements? Would you call it new revivalism? And I'm trying to think of the names of these, new apostolic movement and stuff, Bethel Church and all these kinds of things. Are we on better terms with Pentecostals?
I would say yes. I would say over the last 20 or 30 years, that breach has largely been healed. And I would say it's different from church to church. So some of our churches are, I would say, fairly charismatic, and I would say some of our churches are fairly uncharismatic, which is to say, if there were tongues or some of these manifestations in some churches, it would just kind of flow naturally and everything would be fine. And in other churches, there would be confusion and not really knowing what to do with that. So there is a range, and so this takes me back to that first value of an alliance. It's not like we all agree on the value of what this should look like, but I think that there is a longing to experience Jesus, and some people will experience Jesus more charismatically, and some people will have a more sort of staid kind of an experience.
Yeah, actually, where I grew up, there's it's a small town in northern BC, so there's almost a kind of war between the denominations, a friendly war, let's say. But in that place, it was kind of the Alliance Church and the Pentecostal Church were kind of lumped together against all the Reforms and Anglican churches and stuff. So they were very similar and all friendly, I guess.
Okay. Yeah. I think one of the things we see at Ambrose is a fairly broad range of denominations. Well, there's so many varieties of Baptists, but I think there's something like 50 different denominational brands in our student body. So, again, lots of Pentecostals here, but also Anglicans and Catholics and Lutherans, and so you get a fairly broad mix in terms of spiritual traditions. Hi, Lori.
Hey, sorry. Steve and I just tried the link and it doesn't work.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think they redid their website last summer, and I haven't updated my link. Okay, and I don't even know whether it's still up because, like I say, it's some time ago. But I will find something from David Hearn that illustrates my point, and I'll send it to you. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks. Any other questions, comments, corrections? Okay. So my idea here with these values is that what we need to do to keep our balance is to focus on the main thing, that main value, and at the same time recognize that there's going to be these tensions pulling us in these opposite directions, and that if we move too far in either direction, in a sense, we begin to lose the value. Okay. And so the question that I posed early on is, how do you practice? How do you actually put these values into practice, into ministries that make it clear that this is, in a sense, what we stand for? And so what I'm doing on this slide is trying to focus us on the main thing, but I've given you those tensions to help you look at how is it that we practice being an alliance, and are we too much on the openness side? Are we too much on the conformity side? Do we have that balance just about right? And the same kind of a thing for each of these. Okay, so the idea is we want to be a union of believers cooperating with anybody doing the work of the kingdom, and find ways of partnering rather than competing. In terms of innovation, we want to be unhampered by the way we've always done things. But in terms of, we still need structure. But what we're doing is we're looking for the best ways to do the kingdom work in our current situation, in our current context. And then finally, in terms of our focus on Jesus, we want to be rooted and focused on appropriating the fullness of God's grace in Jesus Christ. We want to be empowered by His Spirit to live lives of holiness and service. So those are kind of three, might call them core values, that I think grow out of our look at history. Okay, I'll pause again. Questions, comments? Okay, I'm going to go back to the aggressive Christianity article by Simpson, which we looked at when we were starting our exploration of missions, and particularly to these two water themes. And so he defined the Christian and Missionary Alliance in terms of deeper faith and aggressive work. And those weren't part of my core values, but that's because, in a sense, I think that this idea undergirds everything that we do. So just to review, the deeper life, this experience of the Spirit, must be the spring of earnest and aggressive work. We cannot give to others more than we ourselves have received. The water can rise no higher than the spring. All missionary enterprise, and I would say all missional work, must have its source in a deeper spiritual life. And then on the other side, the body of water that only receives the inflow of its tributaries and has no outlet from which to discharge its overflow necessarily becomes a stagnant swamp or a dead sea. And I think that is a really interesting image of this idea of I want to focus on my personal spirituality without it giving rise to service leads to this idea of a dead sea. So this I've rebranded rather than aggressive Christianity, missional spirituality. All right, because I think what I'm trying to do here is show that connection between our encounter with Jesus and that outflow into service. And so I think in some sense this is the underlying dynamic, the spiritual dynamic that brings life and vitality to the Christian and Missionary Alliance. And if we lose this connection, if the one stops feeding the other, in a sense, we burn out on the one side, or we just become so inward-looking that our spirituality becomes toxic on the other. Okay, and so again, that theme of balance, which I've been talking about all evening, comes through here as well. We need to recognize that our spirituality gives rise to service, and our service drives us deeper into Jesus. Okay. And as I say here, I think this is key to Alliance identity, this idea of missional spirituality. Questions or comments?
How has the, I think it's a valid model. And I just wonder how we disciple going forward. How does one disciple when we see apparent spirituality, but a lack of service?
Yeah.
It's maybe it's another tension, that one, maybe a pastoral tension in a way.
Yeah, well, it's certainly that. And, I think all of these things, they're not mechanical. And so it's not like if we sort of check all the boxes on one side, then we get all the outcomes that we want, unfortunately. But I think pastorally we can see where people are frustrated because they don't see that there's this vitality or this reality to their spiritual life. So prayer is boring, Bible reading is boring. I do it because that's what Christians do, and that's true. That is what Christians do. But that prayer and that Bible reading, that study, needs to have some service component. It needs to lead to something, and lead to mission in God's kingdom somehow or other. Okay, and if it doesn't, then I think we stagnate. On the other hand, we have people who do like a ton of stuff, and who, in a sense, make the church run, but we wonder where the spiritual depth is. And so we need to then draw them into finding this resource in the presence of Jesus, rather than just in really, really being busy.
Can I insert a thought as well?
Please.
I know, like, just on touching on the point that was just made, I find that perception makes a big deal, or makes a big difference. So people I've talked to that have apparent vibrant spirituality but do nothing formally within the church would, you know, if you dig, which frustrates the pastors to no end. Like, why don't you lead a small group? When you dig a little deeper, they are, you know, extending service in different ways, or they are just perceiving, like what service means and what it means to act out their faith in different ways. So prying into that a little bit and just seeing where there might be differences in definition and expectations has been really beneficial. Still doesn't solve the problem of, like, well, we need people to help make the church go, but, you know.
Yeah, and what that underscores is that all missional service doesn't happen in this congregation. And I think that was one of the things that the early Gospel Tabernacle congregation had right, in that, you know, people were out running orphanages and feeding the poor and doing all this kind of stuff that wasn't necessarily connected directly to the congregation, but was certainly seen as missional service. And so, yeah, people may be involved in their communities where they are sort of salt and light, where they are kingdom servants. But you're right. We still need people to teach Sunday school or lead small groups or whatever. And so what we want to do is empower people to be the kingdom in their neighborhoods, as well as you know, feed the flock that are coming to the church. Helpful comment. Thank you. Other comments or questions?
I found too in our church, there's sometimes people just need to be asked. I have a good friend who's extremely shy, and it took somebody asking them to volunteer, and now they're, I mean, just vital people, and as far as volunteers go in our church. So there's usually a story behind why people aren't helping out.
Yeah, good. All right. Next slide. So the title of this lecture is Living a Tradition. So here where I want to come down to application. So what I've suggested is that there are three things that I think are historic values of the Christian Missionary Alliance. This idea of bringing people together for kingdom service, of looking for new ways to take the gospel to the people who need it, and calling people into this experience of Jesus. And what I want to suggest is that the way in which we sort of bring all of those things together is this idea of missional spirituality. So these four things are a way of defining what it means to be Alliance. Do I have that on the slide? Yeah. So what it means to be Alliance is not having Alliance in your name, which fewer and fewer of our churches do, or having the strange fourfold gospel symbol somewhere either inside or outside your church. In a sense, what it means to be Alliance is embodying these values, of living them out in the way that we do ministry in our churches and in our communities. And so I think that's the challenge going forward, particularly for those who are doing this for licensing. So if you're going to be a licensed Alliance worker, what does that mean? What does that entail? And my suggestion to you, it means embodying these values in some way in the way that you do your ministry. So this leads us to the, I suppose I was going to say the last thing that I'm asking you to do, but the last thing is the exam. So the next to last thing, the penultimate thing. So for your position paper for this week, I want you to write an action plan. So similar format to what you've been doing up until now, but I want you to have this focus on living the tradition. So these points, we've been trying to develop this idea of living tradition as a way of thinking about, understanding, approaching Alliance history and thought. So what I want you to do is see how these values can come to life in the particular context that you're in. So what I want you to do in the action plan, how can the insights and affirmation of the Alliance inform and empower your ministry? And hopefully that will work for most of you. For some of you, you're anticipating doing something rather than are in the middle of it. So you can focus on where you see God calling you and how these things might work out in that context. And again, so I've bolded sort of your ministry. I've bolded the idea of practical ways. And I want you to make this as concrete as possible. So the idea now is we want to turn speculation about what might be different into actions that will make a difference. And so I'll be looking for actions that you see that you could take in your context to live out these values. All right, time for me to stop talking again. And questions or clarification?
Can you guys hear me?
I can hear you.
Because when we did our church history papers, mine was fairly recent. It was all within basically the period of time that I've been involved at our current church. So everything that you're looking for in the action plan is almost going to be repetitive from my history paper.
Sure, that's fine.
Okay.
Yep. Yep. So you can say these are the things that we're doing, and this is how they illustrate some of these Alliance values. Yeah, and you're doing some really cool stuff there, Roy. So, yeah.
Thanks.
Other comments? Okay. I think we're done. That's all I've got. So thank you, folks. Look forward to reading your action plans and next week your exams, and then I think that's that. So thank you for your interaction. I've enjoyed reading the position papers throughout the semester, and some really good thinking and interaction going on there. So thanks for your hard work, and God bless you.
Thanks, man.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ken.
You bet. Hope to see you all in person sometime. Bye-bye.
Bye.